Hello, this is Eddie Barragon. I'm here to give a presentation on asexual versus sexual reproduction. This is a topic I've always been interested in. I always wanted to give a breakdown of the different mating methods and reproductive strategies that different organisms use, both unicellular and multicellular, and be able to measure and weigh out the pros and cons of both methods that various organisms are using, and give a good, proper evolutionary perspective. So the main method that I'm going to basically talk about these two main and distinct evolutionary strategies that different organisms use is kind of break down asexual compared to sexual. They are honestly mostly the only two ways that most organisms are able to reproduce, and it makes sense to compare and contrast because both have different effects on the genetic diversity of the species as a whole and how gene flow occurs in a population. It's something that a lot of people don't really seem to think about, and that is, how do asexual species maintain genetic diversity compared to sexual species, and that's something I want to go over as well. So, going over what I said earlier, sexual reproduction creates offspring from two genetically distinct parents, and what that basically means is that during the reproductive process, when half the chromosomes from the female and half the chromosomes of the male are added during cellular division and during fertilization, basically the genetic material of each parent gets cut in half, but the benefit to that is still that half gets passed down to the next generation, and that random sort of mixing and matching of different genes and alleles is what creates genetic diversity in the population. Compare that to asexual reproduction, where they recreate basically genetically identical offspring, or almost essentially clones of each other. A lot of species that reproduce asexually are essentially genetically a population of clones. However, there's still different strategies that they implement for maintaining their viability as a genetically healthy species. So I'm going to go over first sexual reproduction, and this is going to be broken down into two main sections, this presentation I should say, and that is sexual reproduction and then asexual reproduction. And then we're going to go a little bit over the comparing and contrasting of the two methods. Now, for sexual reproduction, this is by and large the standard for most higher level organisms, and it is the most high stakes and high risk, and I'm going to go over that in a little bit greater detail. So what I mean by high stakes and high risk is that mating is not guaranteed for the majority of the species. Any species that reproduces sexually, competition takes place. Now, males, it's usually in the form of aggression, asserting dominance, violence, mating displays, outcompeting other males, as well as being suitable to be chosen for mating with females. For males, even for things like beetles and aphids and spiders and bees and wasps to some degree. Eusociality is a whole other thing, but for things like that, it's still very much a game of chance. Now, of course, for higher level species like fish and mammals and amphibians and reptiles, birds, it's even greater. A good chunk of males of many different species of these vertebrates do not reproduce, and a smaller percentage of females also do not reproduce due to other reasons besides competition. It could be allocation of resources, it can be not having good mate choices, it can be a whole host of other things, but basically there's a lot more effort and there's a lot more that goes into the process of sexual reproduction compared to asexual reproduction. But by and large, it usually outweighs the cost for a species, because you have all these different genetic mutations and alleles and combinations competing with each other, right? And seeing which one does best in the environment, and being able to sustain itself, feed itself, and compete with other individuals for resources, right? So it kind of elevates the species to arguably, to some extent, weeding out other traits or characteristics that would be less desirable in the population overall. That's kind of the main approach of sexual reproduction. It's by and large a very risky, very resource dependent method of reproduction so far. I'm going to touch base on some of the things that I touched upon earlier and expand on them for this section. So for sexual reproduction, mating rituals, in the process of sexual reproduction, this leads to the complex mating rituals of certain species. For birds, it's usually displays and feather displays, dances. For mammals, it's a bit more direct. It's more males actively fighting with each other, usually loser dies, winner takes all, these sorts of things. It's a double-edged sword, as I said, because it can lead to higher quality individuals mainly, but a lot of other individuals that may have very good genetics and be very, very capable in certain aspects, resource gathering and food, and aren't just, in the form of brute strength, or maybe they don't have the best sense of smell, and like in a bear, and are able to sniff out a female. They're not able to travel as far to find suitable female mates, or maybe they're not quite as large to be able to defend a female from other males, but they might be highly intelligent individuals that are excellent at foraging, gathering, and surviving the winter. It's a give and take. It's a give and take. Sexual reproduction is not perfect, but neither is asexual reproduction. We'll go into that. So gene transfer, by far the most important aspect of sexual reproduction, is the process of the introduction of new genes, random mutations that may or may not be beneficial. That gets passed down and expanded into a population. There's a lot of mutations that are very beneficial that get expanded into a mutation, like just off the top of my head, there's certain birds now that are evolving in a micro rate that are growing smaller and smaller wings to avoid being killed by cars. So in that case, it's sort of like a natural selective process that is impacting mating and reproduction and the passing on of genes, and the genes that these males or females that are carrying smaller and smaller wing sizes are benefiting the species overall to survive in a modern world. Or in the case of humans, malaria, right? A population that was dealing with malaria, and they evolved sickle cell anemia to deal with it. It was beneficial at one point. It almost guaranteed a person to live to at least mating age, 30, 35, and then, die off. Whereas now it's a huge detriment, right? So something that was beneficial once is no longer beneficial. That's another tricky thing about gene transfer, and it's whatever survives in a population, whatever gets widespread, becomes dominant in the population. So it's a give and take. Gene variability is of course a very important thing in the long-term survival of a species, and there's a lot of things that go into that, like disease resistance, resistance to cancers and certain changes, and sudden environmental catastrophes, invasive species. It's complicated for sure, but that is really the main benefit of sexual reproduction, is the high level of variability compared to asexual reproduction. So going over some of the examples, fertilization and meiosis, where gametes combine and form a new individual, and the moment of fertilization, you have a new and unique genome, a new and unique specimen that is created from two semi-random individuals in the population. You have a new combination of genes that are mixing and expressing themselves with each other, creating a whole new individual that has the potential to excel and reproduce in the population, contribute even greater levels of genetic variability. The main benefit, like I said, it really comes down to that, is just how much variation sexual reproduction is able to offer. And the main, I guess what I'm trying to say is the randomness, the high level of uncertainty that a species has is inherently going to benefit from random mixing, because with random mixing being, not only does it create a new and unique genome, but it also creates a breeding ground, I guess you could say, for mutations, for differences in gene expression, for characteristics that could evolve to benefit the species over time and expand and offer much greater resistance to disease, or much greater levels of intelligence, or heat resistance, or homeostatic control, just anything really. Like I said, there are downsides, and that has been touched on before, specifically for a male section of the population. The lack of reproduction success is dramatically lower, and then there are a good chunk of males that get bred out of a population, and that's simply a natural process. There's a lot more. Also, males, our Y chromosomes are a lot smaller than X chromosomes, so that also has a lot to do with reproduction as well. The fact that our chromosomes are half the size of females' double X chromosome makes us more susceptible to genetic diseases and genetic conditions such as Tay-Sachs or Klinefelter or something like that. But yeah, these are just some of the examples of sexual reproduction and the benefits that they entail. So for asexual reproduction, it is less common in vertebrates and invertebrates, and even plants and fungi. Among bacteria, protists, archaea, and similar, it is very bacteria. It's essentially all asexual reproduction, unicellular organisms. This is by and large the more common thing. For simpler life forms, I don't want to say necessarily simpler. A lot of them are genetically more complex. I know, but yeah, asexual reproduction is essentially just where one individual, as in the case of a unicellular organism, simply divides itself and splits itself in half. And you have two identical organisms that are now born and are able to do the same down the line. And then there's higher level asexual reproduction, which we'll touch upon, where females are able to actually give birth to genetically identical females, or a couple of exceptions. But basically that's it. It's a much more straightforward process with sexual reproduction. There's no combining of other genes. There's no crossing over. There's no mixing of two different sets of chromosomes. It's simply reproducing your own current chromosomes, which has its downsides, and we'll touch upon that as I talk about other species that are asexual. So for asexual reproduction, I'm going to go over the pros and cons. It's honestly a bit simpler, more easily digestible than sexual reproduction. The advantages for asexual reproduction are straightforward. It's a lot easier for a species to do it. It's a lot less resource intensive. There's no secondary mating process. There's no mating rituals, there's no displays of dominance, there's nothing, all of the things that we associate with primary sexual characteristics of a species are completely absent for the most part. There are exceptions. Sea snails, for example, they have femoral pores, or a male appendage, and that they fence with each other, dual wield them and fence with each other, and then whoever loses the battle is the one that is fertilized and inseminated, and they have to give birth to the new offspring of the species. But that's, by and large, most asexual reproduction is really just a matter of females or a genetic clone capable of birth either dividing itself in half in the case of a unicellular organism, or simply laying a self-fertilized, self-dividing egg. A lot of species, especially bacteria, are able to grow faster. The populations are able to grow faster. Much more widespread. It's a less resource dependent tactic, and the price is paid for usually lower levels of genetic complexity. It's much more often employed by organisms that reproduce quickly, they spread quickly, and don't live very long typically. And those are the cons as well. Besides ones of just having less genetic variability or resistance to change, to disease, less introduction of new things into the population, because there is no mating happening. So it's entirely dependent on individuals. Just if they have a random mutation, which does happen, then it will simply be a matter of time and competition for those individuals that may have an advantage to take over a population. It's not something that is widespread. It's a lot harder for asexual species to adapt and change over time, essentially. Going over the examples of the different strategies employed that I went over earlier, unicellular organisms are the most commonly able to utilize asexual reproduction, but a lot of multicellular organisms that are of fair levels of complexity are able to do asexual reproduction as well, to some degree. Most fascinating case, in my opinion, is the whiptail lizard. They are 100% asexual. There are no males, and they are very highly complex organisms. They're a vertebrate. They are a reptile lizard, where the species is made up entirely of females that self-fertilize and lay eggs that are genetically identical clones of each other. They have been asexual with no Y chromosome present in the species for geneticists estimate somewhere between 2.6 million years, relatively recent, but still, a while, and a quite unusual and fascinating adaptation and evolutionary ploy by such a high-level organism. There is another process of asexual reproduction that is very unique that I want to go over, and that is another reptile, another lizard, is able to undergo a process called parthenogenesis, or the virgin birth of eggs and new organisms as well, without any stimulation or fertilization from a male. Now, there is a bit of a catch of parthenogenesis. The female has to have mated prior, usually that with another male, and have to reproduce before, and unusually, very unusual in this form of asexual reproduction, all of the offspring laid by the female are male. So what that means basically is that this is sort of like a reservoir or a genetic blueprint, or call it what you will. Somehow the genetic information of the male that the female has mated with prior is saved in the reproductive system of the female. And when times are tough and there's not other males to mate around with, and this is rare because usually there are more males than females competing for reproduction, then they're able to supplement that population naturally by giving birth to new males that would be genetically identical to that previous male, which is fascinating. It's a very unique and unusual process, and there's very few other organisms that can kind of compare to that adaptation. In conclusion, well, a little bit prior, but basically, they're both successful reproductive strategies. They're both things that different species employ to various degrees of success. Obviously, if neither one had any margin of success, they wouldn't still be viable options for a number of different species of varying complexity. I touched upon the drawbacks, I touched upon the pros and cons, gave examples of both. I guess what I would say is, yeah, just overall, I would describe them best as being equal but opposite strategies. They're both equal in terms of their viability and success rates, and they're opposite in their methods and execution for a species. But again, they both have their place in the evolutionary sphere. My final conclusion is essentially for anyone who would be interested in learning more about these two different methods, I would strongly recommend or suggest basically learning is the basics of animal behavior first, and that's something that a lot of people don't take into account, because learning how by and large species interact with each other, even asexual species, there's not mating rituals happening, but there's still certain stimuli and triggers and things like that from the environment mostly that would cause the species to reproduce. Basically, the subject, the complexity of these two different methods is that they both are highly crucial to the the grand scheme of life and to the complexity of the tree of life. I'm very always, I guess I could say, just amazed by how evolution continues to change and baffle, and certain things that we would think of as primitive or necessary or even should be relegated to evolutionary past are still proving themselves to be useful. And that's something that I think of specifically of asexual reproduction, but even sexual reproduction. It is by and large, there's certain species where it's not as viable as it used to be, and animals are responding to that. They're changing to that. Rhinos are not traveling as far to reproduce. They're traveling much slower, much quicker, and much more often. Same thing with cheetahs. They're not running down their mates anymore. And it's just evolution changes animals, the behavior of animals change. And yeah, I guess I would say that learning about the behavior of these animals, learning about the methods of reproduction, of species procreation, propagation, is crucial to understanding life on this planet as a whole. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm Eddie Barragon again, and I appreciate all the consideration and patience and intrigue or whatever my presentation was able to give to you. Thank you.